Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Okay, today is April 11th? I know it's sometime in April. April 11th, 2015. Okay, good morning, everybody. Okay, today we will be taking in the Majjhima Nikaya Sutta number 129. This is called the Bālapaṇḍita Sutta, the discourse on the fools and the wise men. And this sutta is a bit different from many of the other suttas that we've covered so far, since many of the suttas that we've been examining deal with, you might call it, the path to liberation. And they deal with different philosophical topics, methods of meditation, methods of personal training. But this, we have to remember that the path to liberation takes place in the original context of the Buddha's teaching. It takes place against the larger background to the Buddha Dharma, which is the process of samsara, that is the process of repeated existence within the round of rebirths. And the Buddha, as a fully enlightened spiritual teacher, doesn't teach only the path to liberation, but it's said, for example, in Majjhima Nikaya Sutta number 12, one of the attributes of the Buddha, his powers of knowledge, is the knowledge of the paths leading to all destinations. And so the Buddha knows not only the way to final liberation, but he knows the paths that lead to lower types of rebirth, rebirth into the hell realm, the animal realm, the realm of the pretas or afflicted spirits. He knows the path to the human rebirth and the path to a heavenly or celestial rebirth. And so part of the Buddha's mission as a spiritual teacher, he's not only teaching people who have little dust in their eyes, who are ready for liberation, but he's also teaching great numbers of ordinary people who still have far to go in their migration through samsara. And so he has to teach them how to avoid the fall into lower types of rebirth and how to practice in ways that will help them achieve higher types of rebirth. And he also has to point out, in order to motivate people to avoid the types of conduct that lead to lower rebirths, he has to point out the dangers and the misery in the lower types of rebirth. And also, in order to motivate people to practice virtuous types of deeds that will lead to a higher rebirth, he has to point out the blessings and benefits of rebirth in the higher realms. And in going about this task, the Buddha sometimes compares himself to a horse trainer. Like the horse trainer uses two types of methods to train the horse. Maybe in American idiom we would use the expression, he uses the stick and the carrot. That is, to get the horse to perform certain tricks. Sometimes he'll have to hit the horse with the whip. And at other times, or with other types of horses, he'll reward them with extra carrots or whatever food they like to eat. Chocolates and ice cream. And so the Buddha uses similar types of techniques, sometimes in order to get people to avoid bad, unwholesome conduct. He'll point out the misery and suffering and terrors of the lower realms, particularly of rebirth in the hell realm. And then to motivate people to do the good, he'll point out and describe the bliss and the pleasure and the glory of rebirth in the heavenly realms. Of course, for the Buddha, rebirth in heaven is not the final goal of his teaching. It's just call it a halfway house, a stepping stone, a sort of temporary respite from the miseries of rebirth in the lower realms. But it's possible from the heavenly realms to gain the paths and fruits and even to reach final liberation in the heavenly realms. It's sometimes said that the Buddha says that the human realm is the best of all realms. I don't think that's completely true according to the early teachings. What is said is that it's in the human realm that a Buddha arises, because it's in the human realm that there is the right combination of suffering and happiness, of transience and some stability. And so a Buddha who has to discover the path for himself always arises in the human realm. And maybe for many beings, human existence provides that right combination of suffering and ease to motivate them to enter the path. But once one gains a right view, a right understanding, the heavenly realms provide much more suitable and congenial conditions for making further progress on the path. And so the Buddha doesn't tell people to avoid a heavenly rebirth and try to come back to the human realm, but he tells them to aspire for rebirth in the good destinations. And the good destinations include the human realm and the heavenly realms. What is to be avoided, according to the Buddha's teaching, is rebirth in the formless realms. Because in the formless realms, one doesn't have any opportunity to hear the Dhamma, because one doesn't have a bodily form, and so one doesn't have ears with which one could hear the Dhamma being taught. But the beings in the other heavenly realms do have ears, do have physical bodies, and so they can, in their mode of existence, they can hear the Dhamma even from the Buddha. They can witness the Buddha teaching the Dhamma in the human realm, and they could participate in the assemblies, the Dharma assemblies. Though we don't see them, but they will be present, it said, invisible to us, but they can perceive the Buddha and the human beings. And so they can witness the Dhamma being taught in the human realm by the Buddha. And so the Buddha, in a general way, he divides the different realms within samsara into two broad levels. So we have two broad levels. One is called, can you see? One is called Dugati, which means, Gati means the destination. In other words, it means a realm of rebirth. And the prefix dur means bad. So these are the bad destinations. And there are said to be three bad destinations. The hell realms, of which there are there are many. The animal realm, and then there are the pretas, which is translated into Chinese as Wei, which means hungry ghosts or hungry spirits. But they're not only afflicted by hunger, but sometimes by extreme thirst, other types of misery. So I render the expression as the afflicted spirits. Okay, then there's a kind of dividing line, a boundary, and then above that boundary we have what is called Sugati, which are the good destinations, the good, desirable realms of rebirth. And that is the human realm, which again, there are many different gradations within the human realm. Then there are the 6 sense sphere heavens, in which the beings still have full sense faculties and enjoy sensual pleasures, but the pleasures are much more refined than in the human realm, and the joy and happiness, it's much more intense than in the human realm. Then above the sense sphere heavens, we have the form realm, inhabited by divine beings of great power and majesty, and whose main type of experience is deep meditative bliss. And then above the form realm, there is the formless realm, in which all bodily form, all material form has dropped away, and the beings exist there just as consciousness, as mind. Existence in those realms is said to be very peaceful, very equanimous. But there's no capacity in that realm, as I said earlier, for hearing the Dhamma. And so if one is reborn there through the power of samadhi, very deep meditative absorption, one could pass aeons in deep serenity, tranquility, imperturbable equanimity, but there's no opportunity to develop insight wisdom there, the wisdom that leads to liberation. Okay, so coming back from this elegant and complicated cosmology to the sutta. Okay, here the Buddha is going to speak about the contrast between foolish people and wise people. And he's going especially to elaborate the type of rebirth that awaits each type, each kind of person. So he begins by saying that there are three characteristics of a fool, signs of a fool, attributes of a fool. The word for fool is Bāla, which sometimes is used to mean a child. I think in singular it's used to mean a child, is that correct? Bāla? You're Sinhalese? Okay. Yeah, but originally the sense is that of a fool. And the Buddha says that there are three ways that one could understand who is a fool. That is, by way of their thinking, their speech, and their bodily actions. So the fool is one who thinks bad thoughts, speaks bad words, and does bad deeds. And this sutta doesn't fully explicate what is meant by bad deeds, bad words, bad thoughts, but other suttas, see, the Buddha's teaching is always very systematic, and usually to make it easy to remember, the Buddha lays down different aspects of the teaching in numerical schemes. And so you don't have to struggle to look in this sutta, that sutta, but when you know the numerical scheme, then you can fill in what is intended. So what is the numerical scheme that encapsulates bad deeds, bad speech, bad thoughts? Anybody know what it is? We've come across it many times. No.
10 unwholesome deeds.
Right, exactly. It's called the 10 unwholesome deeds, or the 10 pathways of unwholesome deeds. So bad bodily actions, killing, stealing, sexual misconduct. Bad verbal deeds, lying, slanderous speech, or sometimes called divisive speech, harsh speech, idle chatter or gossip. Then bad thoughts would be thoughts which are governed by covetousness, that is, desiring to get the possessions of others, anger, ill will, wishing harm to others, and wrong views. Okay, so the fool is one who is characterized briefly by bad thoughts, bad words, bad deeds. In more detail, one who engages repeatedly in the 10 courses of unwholesome action. Okay, now the Buddha is going to explain the dangers or the disadvantages in being a fool. That is, in engaging in these types of unwholesome thoughts, words, and deeds. And he's going to do this by dividing the dangers or disadvantages into 2 broad categories. One are the dangers visible right here and now in this life, and then the dangers that lie ahead in the future life. And he's going to explain 3 types of dangers right here and now. So he says, a fool feels pain and grief here and now in 3 ways. The first, we might say briefly, is acquiring a bad reputation. And this is rather stated a bit indirectly here. So that's when a fool is seated. It might be indirectly, but I know it's a situation I'm quite familiar with myself. A fool is seated in an assembly or along a street or in a square, and people are discussing certain pertinent and relevant matters. So if the fool is one who kills, who takes life, takes what is not given, misbehaves in sensual pleasures, speaks falsehood, and engages in liquor and intoxicants, then he thinks, these people are speaking about these matters, and I am one who engages in these things. And so when people are criticizing one who takes life, who steals, and so on, then the fool applies that to himself and thinks, if people knew what I am doing, then they would all sort of gang up on me and blame me and criticize me and reproach me for what I'm doing. And in fact, it often happens that the fool is one who gets caught. When especially powerful people in positions of we have some of these cases of prominent politicians. I remember there was a governor or representative from South Carolina who claimed that some years ago that he was going someplace on a health resort to restore. He was hiking the Appalachian Trail, but then somehow they discovered that he was going off, was it to South America, to have an affair with his mistress, and he was a married man. And then all of this got blown up in the news, and he had to resign from his office.
You're engaging in these, obviously you have wrong views, so it would require a bit of insight of your own.
Well, I think the fool would know that he's engaging in these things, and so when people are speaking critically about them, in his own mind he would know that he's one who engages in these things, but he wouldn't be willing to open himself up and to admit to others that he engages in them. Okay, and then we have many prominent politicians who are getting, kickbacks from companies that they lobby for or that they support with their votes. And so this is, I guess it's illegal to get kickbacks in this way, to accept bribes, which is a form of taking what is not given. And then every once in a while, usually when there are committees to criticize bribery, these are the guys who get on the committees and are the most vocal critics. We have to have laws against this, we need stricter regulations. But then when the company comes and says, will you support our policy? And here we give you, if you check your bank account, you'll find a deposit of $10,000 has just been entered there. Okay, so when the fool hears those who engage in these things being criticized, well, I think most fools would not be so sensitive about that. They wouldn't really care. But there might be some who have a sense of conscience, and when they hear this, then they feel guilty about it. So that's one kind of pain and grief that the fool feels here and now. Okay, a second one, when a robber culprit is caught, a fool sees the kings having many kinds of torture inflicted on him. Like in those days, one didn't simply get a prison sentence and get, 10 years, 20 years in prison, where you're living in fairly, I don't want to endorse the American prison system in any way, but one is still getting 3 meals a day, living in fairly comfortable conditions. You get at least an hour of exercise a day. If you get ill, they'll bring in a doctor to check one and prescribe medication. But in ancient India, it was not like that at all. But if you're arrested by the king, you get flogged with whips, beaten with canes, beaten with clubs. You could have your hands cut off, feet cut off, ears cut off, nose cut off, and subjected to a number of tortures which are not explained here. The commentary explains them. I want to spare the more sensitive members of the class by withholding detailed explanations. They call them the porridge pot, the polished cell shave, Rahu's mouth, the fiery wreath, the flaming hand, and so on. One has them splashed with boiling oil, thrown to the dogs, impaled on stakes, and have their heads cut off with a sword. Okay, so then when the fool hears about these torments, and he realizes these things that he himself engages in the same type of actions, then he will feel, I would say, not pain and grief, but fear and terror of being caught. So this would be the second type of, what's called the second type of pain and grief. And then what happens, of course, if one is caught and then subjected to these tortures, that's even more severe misery in this life. Okay, then comes the third danger or misery. That is when the fool is this would be the kind of misery of a heavy conscience. So when the fool is on his chair or on his bed or resting on the ground, and there's nothing else to distract him, then sometimes the thoughts of his unwholesome deeds come and they cover up his mind, they spread over him and envelop him, just like the shadow of a mountain. And I think this is, so it doesn't say so explicitly here, but this is indicating what happens to the fool when he's on the verge of death. You know, when he's in his final days, when he's not able to distract himself by indulging in sensual pleasures, but now he's incapacitated. And so there comes a kind of replay in the mind of everything one has done in one's past in this life. It all gets played back before the mind. And so he's now recollecting his misconduct of body, speech, and mind, and it's all starting to weigh heavily on him. And so he thinks, in this life, I have not done what is good. I have not done what is wholesome. I have not made for myself a shelter from anguish, but I have done what is evil, cruel, and wicked. And then he starts thinking of what destination lies ahead for him. And he realizes that I shall go to the destination of those who have done what is bad. And so then he starts sorrowing, weeping and lamenting, beating his breast. Okay, so that is the third type of misery relating to this life itself. But then, now we come to the other type of misery. This is the misery pertaining to the future life. And so it said that the fool who is engaged in misconduct of body, speech, and mind on the dissolution of the body after death reappears in a state of deprivation. That is, in one of the bad destinations, even in hell. And now the Buddha is going to go into a somewhat detailed description of the bad destinations, at least of hell and the animal realm. Okay, so the Buddha begins, he sort of opens up the topic by saying that this is utterly undesirable, utterly miserable, utterly disagreeable. That is the suffering of hell. And when the Buddha says this, then a monk asks the Buddha, is it possible to give a simile for the suffering of hell? And then the Buddha gives a rather impressive or even terrifying simile. He says, suppose there's a man who has been caught, a robber who has been caught by the police, by the king's men, and they present him to the king, saying that this man is a robber. Order whatever punishment you will for him. And notice that he doesn't get a fair trial, but just by the report of the king's men, the king on his own, he's entitled to inflict the punishment. So he says, go and strike this man in the in the morning with 100 spears. And so in the morning, they strike him with 100 spears. Excuse me. I have a nasty sense of humor. a sadistic sense of humor.
Did you go through this when you were doing the translations?
This laughter? I don't think so. Okay, then at noon, the king asks his men, how is that man? Is he still alive? How is that man doing? Like as if there would be any doubt. He's been hit by 100 spears. How could he be alive? But somehow, by a miracle, the men say, he's still alive. So the king says, then get some medical attendants to look after him and bring him back to health. No, that's not what the sutta says. According to the sutta, the king says, go and strike that man with another 100 spears. Please, a little compassion, sir. Okay, so the men hit him with another 100 spears. Then in the evening, the king says, how's that man doing? Oh, he's in wonderful condition. He's been playing out in the yard. He's joined the soccer team. No, they say, he's still alive, sir. So the king says, well, we really have to look after him, give him nourishing food, get a doctor for him, treat his wounds. But no, the king says, it's evening, go and strike that man again with 100 spears. And so in the evening, they strike him with 100 spears. So then the Buddha says, what do you think? Wouldn't that man experience great misery and grief because of being struck with 300 spears? And so the monk says, surely that man would experience pain and grief even if he were hit by 1 spear, which is certainly enough, let alone 300. 100 in the morning, 100 in noon, 100 in the evening. Okay, then the Buddha takes a small stone up in his hand and he says, what do you think? Which is greater, this small stone that I'm holding in my hand or the Himalayan mountains? And of course the monk says that the small stone in the Buddha's hand is very small. It's nothing compared to the Himalayan mountains. And so then the Buddha says that this pain and grief, the misery and pain and the torment that man experienced by being struck with 300 spears is nothing compared to the suffering of hell. It's not even a fraction. There is no comparison. The other day after I was reviewing this sutta, in the evening I have to take this. It's an extraction. It's from cayenne pepper. It's a tincture, yes, a tincture. And so usually I take 20 drops of it and I mix it in water and put in some of the sour apple cider. And then every evening I drink it and I can take it. It's a bit hot because of the cayenne, but when it's diluted with enough water, then it's tolerable. It's a little burning sensation in the mouth, but it's tolerable. But the other day, I must have forgotten to put in sufficient water. But I put in the cayenne, the drops of cayenne, 20 drops. Then I took it full shot in my mouth, the way I usually do. And it was just burning so hot that I just ran to the bathroom and spit it out and drank cup after cup of water, and it took about 15 minutes before the burning sensation subsided. And then I was thinking, on the basis of the sutta, if this is just like a pebble compared to the suffering of hell, I can't imagine what the suffering of hell is like. If anybody wants to try taking 20 drops of cayenne pepper in just a tiny bit of water, I'll invite you to try it. Okay, so now the Buddha is going to explain in detail the suffering of hell. And so I think you can read this on your own. I don't have to go into the detail. But he begins by explaining this seems to be the suffering that one undergoes at the entrance to the hell. That the wardens of hell give him what's called the fivefold transfixing. That is, they drive a red-hot iron stake through each hand, that's 2, through each foot, that's 4, and then they drive the other stake through the breast. And so now he feels extremely excruciating, agonizing pain, but this is the key for the suffering of hell. He does not die so long as that evil karma that brought him there is not exhausted. Okay, then the text describes other types of suffering or torture that he undergoes in hell. And all of this seems to be the part of the preliminary torture, because it's finally, it's paragraph 16, that the wardens of hell throw him into what is called the great hell, the Mahaniraya. And this is described as having 4 corners with 4 doors, one on each side. It's walled up with iron and shut in with an iron roof. Its floor as well is made of iron and heated till it glows with fire. The range is a full 100 leagues, which it covers all pervasively. And if you want to read a detail, if this isn't enough for you, if you want to read a detailed description of the suffering in the great hell, then you can go on to the next sutta, sutta number 130, called the Divine Messengers, which also is paragraph 16 there. It has this same statement about the great hell, but then it goes on into a detailed description of the misery, the torment of the great hell. But here the Buddha just cuts it short and says that he could go on and explain at length the suffering in hell. But now the Buddha passes to describe the suffering in the animal realm. This is another one of the types of existence in the bad destinations. So he speaks about animals that feed on grass. And so a fool that here delighted in tastes and did evil actions, then might be reborn amongst the animals that feed on grass, like horses, cattle, donkeys, goats, and deer. But then there are animals that feed on dung. For example, certain types of poultry, pigs, dogs, and jackals. And here the Buddha almost mockingly compares these type of animals to the Brahmins, who when they smell a sacrifice go running to the sacrifice thinking, we can eat here, we can eat here. And so there are other animals, there are animals who when they smell dung, they go running to the dung thinking, there's a meal for us, here there's a meal for us. And so the fool who formerly delighted in taste and did bad deeds can be reborn in the company of the animals that feed on dung. Then there are animals that are born, grow old, and die in darkness, like moths, maggots, earthworms, and other such animals. Okay, so that's a possible realm of rebirth for fools. Then there are animals that are born, age, and die in water, like fish, turtles, and crocodiles. And so that's another realm of rebirth for the fool. Then there are animals that are born, age, and die. Here it's called filth, but I think it actually means in the carcasses of other animals. Because the example is given of animals that are born, age, and die in a rotten fish or a rotten corpse, in rotten porridge, in a cesspit or in a sewer. And so that's a possible realm of rebirth for fools who do evil deeds. And again, the Buddha says that he could speak at length about the misery of an animal rebirth, but this much is sufficient. Then he uses a simile to show how difficult it is when one is reborn in the bad destinations, how difficult it is to return to rebirth in the human realm. Often this simile, I think, gets misquoted, and I think it gets distorted even in the Sutta Nikaya, where it's said that, if I remember in the Sutta Nikaya, it says that it's just to receive a human rebirth is as difficult as it is for a turtle to put its head through a yoke on the ocean, a yoke with one hole. But that's, I think, an incomplete version of the simile. The simile in full, it should say that it's when one falls away from the human realm into the realm of misery, into the bad destinations, then it becomes as difficult to obtain a human rebirth again as it is for the turtle to put its head through the yoke with one hole floating on the ocean. And so here we have the simile in paragraph 24. So we have the yoke floating on the ocean, carried by the winds in the different directions. And then there's a blind turtle that comes to the surface once at the end of each century. And so then the Buddha asks, would that blind turtle put his neck into that yoke with one hole in it? And the monk says, he might do so sometime or other at the end of a long, long period. Then the Buddha says, that blind turtle would sooner put his neck into the yoke with a single hole in it than a fool once gone to perdition, that is, once gone to rebirth in the lower destinations. Okay, the blind turtle would sooner put his neck into the yoke with a single hole in it than a fool once gone to perdition would take to regain the human state. And why is that? Because when one goes to the bad destinations, there is no practicing of the Dhamma. Here the Dhamma is in the broad sense of what is virtuous or righteous. There is no practicing of what is righteous, no doing of what is wholesome, no performance of merit. There, what prevails is mutual devouring and the slaughter of the weak. If you think about life in the animal realm, it's a state of constant fear and craving. If you look at some of these programs like Nature's World or Nature, where they show what life is like out in the wild, the animals, the predators are driven by, extremely pressing hunger. They drive always to have to eat by killing other creatures. And so for them, their life, their subsistence depends upon killing. And then for the other animals, the herbivorous animals, they live in constant fear and terror. Every little rustling of the leaves in the tree brings fear and terror that there'll be a predator waiting for them, about to jump on them, pounce on them, and kill them and devour them. And if you look at these nature programs, you see the lion pounce on the antelope out on the plain of Africa, the savanna, and the poor antelope struggling to escape and often finally succumbing to the lion. Okay, then the Buddha continues, at some time at the end of a long period, the fool comes back into the human state through some type of residual meritorious deed that he might have done earlier. So he'll take a human rebirth, but because that merit or virtuous conduct it's being impeded by the impact of many other unvirtuous or unwholesome deeds. So when he takes rebirth, he is reborn into a low family. And here the Buddha mentions some of the low types of livelihood in India of that period. One that is poor with little to eat and drink, where one survives with difficulty. And when he takes rebirth, he is said to be ugly, unsightly, misshapen, sickly, blind, lame, paralyzed, and he has trouble getting sufficient food, drink, clothes, and so on. And then, maybe because he's been reborn into a low family and subjected to bad influences, then he misbehaves in body, speech, and mind, creating more unwholesome karma, so that with the breakup of the body after death, he is reborn again in a state of misery, a bad destination, even in hell. And then the Buddha compares us to a gambler who, with an unlucky throw, loses his child, his wife, all his property, and even goes into bondage himself. Yet the Buddha says that unlucky throw of the dice is negligible. The far more unlucky throw is when one misconducts oneself in body, speech, and mind, and then takes rebirth in a bad destination. Okay, maybe at this point I'll ask whether there's any questions or comments. Maybe we take the wireless microphone.
Bhante, the analogy about the turtle, does it matter whether they were, the person was in a human realm and went down, and then the possibility of his coming back to the human realm, or whether he was always in the human realm makes no difference, isn't it? Because in the human realm, you know right from wrong and you can do good. From an animal realm, you probably wouldn't know that anyway. So it will be as difficult whether you came from human to a lower realm and come back to human, or whether you were never in the human realm and still wants to go back.
Well, I think the original point of the simile is that if one loses the status, the human status, or status as a divine being, a celestial being, and takes rebirth in the lower realm, then it becomes as difficult as the turtle to stick the head through the yoke. Yeah, then it becomes as difficult as it is for the turtle to stick its head through the yoke. But in the other version, but this implies that a human being, by doing good, can continue to be reborn in the human realm and in the heavenly realms. Whereas the other way this simile is presented, it makes it seem that for us human beings, almost all of us, with very few exceptions, are going to fall away from our human status and take rebirth in the plane of misery. Yeah, that's the point, is that when you get reborn in the lower realms, then it becomes extremely difficult to rise up again. But if, as a human being, if one, accepts or follows a righteous, wholesome way of life, then one will be creating the wholesome karma that will lead back to human rebirth and to heavenly rebirth. This is what is said in the Sutta. But I have to say, I've read cases of people who have rebirth memories. I remember a case that I read, there's a book of case studies that was done by Ian Stevenson together with Francis Story. And Ian Stevenson was investigating, in particular, people who as babies, or when they were born, they were reborn with certain, when they were born with certain birthmarks, certain bodily disfigurations, and then trying to find out from those who had memories of their past life what might have explained that birthmark. And one of them, a man who had a kind of, he was born with a scar on his belly, and he was able to remember that in his past life he was raping a woman and the woman pulled a knife on him and stabbed him in the belly, and as a result of that he died, and now he's reborn as a human child, and the trace of the stab with the knife is that scar on the belly. So one has to imagine that a person who's in the process of raping a woman has an extremely unwholesome mind, and on top of that he's getting stabbed by her, so he'll be extremely angry and violently angry, and yet he comes to a human rebirth. How to explain that, I don't know.
Then would the karma that hasn't been realized or hasn't been eradicated, would that lead to hell in a future rebirth? Because when you do something of that magnitude, and
It would seem that it would have to lead certainly to some type of rebirth in the realm of misery. It's also possible that a person who is killed, stabbed while raping the woman, maybe got reborn in a hell realm. And the experience of time there could be very different from experience of time in the human realm. So in that realm, it might seem that he's there for hundreds of years and then passes away and comes back, maybe through some wholesome karma, comes back to the human realm. I think this was somebody in Thailand. So maybe he had been a pious Buddhist in his youth, and then got sort of corrupted later in life, and so took to raping the woman. But maybe earlier in life, he had done meritorious deeds, so after spending what seemed like hundreds of years in hell, but because of the difference in the experience of time, from a human standpoint, it would seem like just seconds there, that he comes back into the human realm, and now as a result of that deed, he still has some residual karma, which appears bodily in the form of that scar on the belly.
But also, I guess every time you see that scar, it's a reminder, and it brings back kind of a guilt for
Well, for him,
past
because he has
deeds,
that
yeah.
memory. I don't know the further details of the case.
Also, is it an accumulation of karma, or is it one deed that leads you to these realms, would you say?
Yeah, this is... I'd say that the matter itself is not explicitly discussed in the suttas themselves, but the way it's presented by the commentaries, that there are certain sequence in which the karmas that one has done takes on the role of determining one's form of rebirth. And so if one has committed an extremely heavy deed, an extremely heavy unwholesome deed, that unwholesome deed will sort of take precedence and determine the rebirth in the next existence. Okay, if one doesn't have an extremely heavy unwholesome deed, the next in sequence will be some strong unwholesome or wholesome deed that one does shortly before death. This is called the death proximate karma. So that could sort of shift the direction of rebirth away from a bad rebirth towards a good one, or away from a good rebirth towards a bad one. If one has done some morally significant good or bad deed shortly before death. But if one doesn't have such a death proximate karma, then it will be one's habitual karma that determines the direction of rebirth.
Because it says, I read where bad karma can be mitigated by doing wholesome deeds, but also when we did the Dhamma class, we mentioned about the things we think about when we're dying, and those thoughts and creating a kind of a wholesome state before death.
Yeah, one can, shortly before death, one can say if one has accumulated a lot of unwholesome karma, one can direct the mind towards the wholesome by developing or trying to develop strong wholesome thoughts. And that could take on the role of generating the rebirth, so that one could get a good rebirth as a result of those wholesome thoughts. But this doesn't mean that one escapes the bad karma. That bad karma could either manifest in the form of limiting conditions and obstructive conditions in the next life, or else it can remain in a residual form and then manifest at a later time and generate a bad rebirth into a future life. And the converse with bad thoughts, heavy bad thoughts before death can negate the results of accumulated wholesome karma.
Bhante, in Buddhist cosmology, in the Abhidhamma, I believe there's 39 different hell realms.
I don't remember the count.
Yeah, I know it was something like 36 or 39, where there's a couple of main ones, and then
Yeah, there are great
on
hells.
5 sides there are there are smaller hells.
I think that there are like 16 great hells, and each one has auxiliary hell on each of its sides, so that 16 times 4 is 64. 64 plus 16. Of course, you have to take the central hills. I think, yeah. Anyway,
Yeah, I was just stating
Oh.
that it's not just one hell, there's
no,
many
there
different,
are many.
according to your karma
Yeah.
and whatever deed you've done, you can end up in any
Yeah.
one of these realms.
Yeah. And there are supposed to be cold hells, hot hells, hells of being stabbed with swords. Yeah.
The Buddha is saying these are similes, but
Which are similes?
that he's presenting similes for hell.
Yeah.
But I find it very disturbing, the notion that if to finally be reborn in the human realm,
Yeah.
you're born as poor, ill, disfigured. That seems to me coming directly from the caste system.
I have to say, I agree with that. I find that problematic myself.
Okay, there's
Because
no way
one-
out of that problem.
What is
other
that?
than he's just giving similes, not truth.
It's stated as though it's to be taken literally, but
Yeah.
I find it a bit troubling that, somebody could cite this as not quite a justification for the class system, but as an explanation that the class system is in some way grounded upon past karma, and so those who are born into the lower classes deserve their lower rebirth. And what's a little interesting and problematic is the association of low rebirth with physical deformities
Yes.
and disabilities, as though those who are reborn or born into higher classes are inevitably handsome, beautiful, and physically fit. But it seems people with physical defects, deformities, disabilities will hit people in all classes. And I don't think that beauty in any way is a privilege of those in upper class, in the higher classes, and excluded from the lower classes.
But
I mean,
there-
how many, say, strikingly beautiful Hollywood or European movie stars, many of them just came from the ordinary, ranks of ordinary social classes, but somehow their karma brought them to those lower social classes, but they had beautiful features. Yes, please. Wait, please take the microphone.
I think the other way one can probably look at it is that, if you're born in a higher class or a lower class, what is the opportunity you get to improve your karma,
Yeah,
to be more mindful? So if you're
Yeah.
born in a higher class,
Yeah.
you may not really find the challenges that you need to,
Yeah.
think about improving yourself.
yeah.
So that's
Yeah.
just one spin.
Yeah, this happens to a lot of people who are reborn onto what would be very favorable conditions. In fact, there is a sutta. It comes, let's see, both in the Samyutta Nikaya and the Anguttara Nikaya, which speaks about moving from, let's see how it goes, those who go from darkness to darkness, from darkness to light, from light to darkness, and from light to light. Then those who go from darkness to light are those who are born into poverty, who face many difficulties getting food, clothing, shelter, but they do good deeds of body, speech, and mind. And well, this is explained in the process of rebirth. In the course of rebirth, then they take a higher rebirth. But there are those who are reborn, those who move from light to darkness, are those who are reborn into high social class with all the opportunities, but they engage in misconduct of body, speech, and mind. Then they take rebirth in the lower realms And when they come back to the human realm, they're reborn in the lower classes. But also what strikes me is that often it's people who are reborn, or let's say born into the lower classes, because they face many challenges, often they can emerge as great people. So that's what gives them the opportunity to develop qualities of persistence, energy, determination, striving to improve themselves. Whereas the privileged kids become lackadaisical, dissolute. Well, what we call the caste system didn't really exist in India as such during the Buddha's time. What existed was called the system of the varnas, which is usually translated as social classes. So there was a broad stratification of society into 4 classes, and then they were ranked differently according to the Brahmins and the Buddhas. So in the Buddha's way of ranking, at the top are the Kshatriyas. That's the ruling or the aristocrats who exercise governmental administrative power. Those are the princes, the administrators, the rulers. Then come the Brahmins, the priestly class, who maintain the study of the Vedas and perform the religious rites and rituals. But in the Buddha's time, many of the Brahmins were no longer performing the religious rites, but they were landowners who were basically cultivating the land. Okay, then the third class are the Vaishyas, who are the landowners and the mercantile class, engaging in business as well as agriculture. And then there's the Shudras, that's the working class, the servants, the servile class. And then outside these 4 social classes are what would be called the scheduled classes, those that are regarded as outcasts. I'm not sure, because I don't really know the Rig Veda very well. But the class system was instituted pretty much after the Aryan people came from Central Asia and came over through the Kush Mountains and then entered into India. Then they established this system of social classes. Excuse me? Yeah, the Rig Veda is considered the oldest stratum of the Vedas, but whether it has the class system, I don't know. The Buddha himself actually didn't preach against the class system, saying that we have to abolish the class system. He left the class system intact, but what he did within his own system of teaching. Please let me just finish the explanation. He seems to have collapsed all the householders or all lay people into 3 groups. The Kshatriyas, the Brahmins, he left them intact. He grouped everybody else together into the broad class of what he calls householders. Within the monastic order, the Buddha says that when one goes forth, then one gives up one's clan and class identity and becomes known simply as a Buddhist monk or Buddhist nun. And then within the monastic order, there are no class distinctions. They don't have any meaning. But the Buddha didn't preach trying to abolish the class system. But what he said is that anybody from that true spiritual worth doesn't depend upon one's class status. That one who develops, who observes the precepts, who follows the 10 courses of wholesome action, who engages in the various spiritual practices, can become a person of spiritual attainment. Without it, that doesn't depend on class identity. Richard? Please take the microphone.
Yeah, Varna originally meant color,
Yeah.
and it's tied to the Aryan invasion. That is, you have people coming down from the area around the Caucasus who became the upper castes,
Yeah.
as the three upper castes,
Yeah.
and the Shudras were people who'd already been there,
Yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
the outcasts were
Yeah.
people who had warred against the invading groups and lost, and were then kept outside and were regarded as polluting to have
Yeah.
any contact with.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? But also, the word caste is the Brahmin term that's used for the seating arrangements in Hindu temples. And the Varna system, the color system, was to have those four castes. But what they never tell you is, you need a sociologist for, is that the top three castes comprise 8 to 12% of the population,
Yeah.
right? Depending on how you count the different ranks, sub-ranks of those castes, and that the Shudras are 65% of the population. The untouchables,
Yeah.
now ex-untouchables, the Dalits,
Yeah.
right, of 16 to 19%,
Yeah, yeah.
and the Adivasis, the tribals, about 7.5%.
Yeah.
It is the Indian government has now made it illegal
Yeah,
to publish statistics on populations by caste and wealth, and so relation between wealth and social status, because they think those figures inflame people to revolution. Right? And so it's very difficult to
Yeah.
get that information
Yeah.
right now. But the thing is, it really is a color system. I mean, it's
Yeah.
parallel completely to the American racial system.
Yeah.
Okay? And, to me, this is horrifying.
Yeah.
It's also, I think, very difficult to conclude that the Buddha himself ever said anything like this, because you have got like 300-400 years before things were written down, and during that time, most converts to Buddhism were mainly coming from the upper caste, and just like with Nalganda and so on, you had groups like. I'm sorry, but you had major Buddhist theoreticians and so on who had been born Brahmin, and they imported a lot of Brahmin ideology into Buddhism, partly because they didn't distinguish between things that the Buddha said himself and things that were said to him by Hindu interlocutors, and they used those occasions to act as if the Buddha had adopted the beliefs of the Hindus that he was speaking to. Okay? And so you've got several hundred years there of enormous confusion, in which was plenty of opportunity to make claims about what the Buddha had said and to make it look as if the Buddha didn't want to disturb the caste system or believed it in, and so on. It's very difficult for me to believe this.
Yeah,
And,
though there are enough suttas, I would have to say, in which the Buddha, even in the Majjhima Nikaya, in which the Buddha doesn't, as I said earlier, he doesn't reject the class system, sort of advocating its abolition in the wider society, maybe because that system had been so firmly established that he saw it was impossible to do directly, through trying to agitate for a social revolution. But there are enough suttas in which the Buddha rejects the idea that in some way the worth or value of a person is determined by their class status.
Sir, it's not a class system. It's a caste system. There's a profound difference. First off, the word caste refers to a seating arrangement. It's a Brahmin term. That what is underneath that is a system called the jati system. There are 6,000 jatis.
Yeah,
they are local.
Yeah, I understand.
And,
Yeah, I
very
underst-
different. It's very different from class
I-
because it's
wait,
not
let me just
primarily
explain.
economic.
Yeah, I understand, this is a matter of terminology, the word caste to be equated with jati. Jati means birth.
Yeah, but it's not. That is, that's a Buddhist interpretation of the system.
No, this is
As
the way I've
Buddhists
seen it.
claim that the jati system is adequately described by the caste system, and that's the theory that they've pervaded, that they have pervaded outside of India. And so it's the upper castes who have controlled international perception of India. And they have done it because for a long time they were the only people with the money and the status to have any contact with foreigners. And so they succeeded in getting people to believe that India was organized the way that they said it was. It is not. It's propaganda.
Yeah. Anyway, this is a matter that I'll have to do some further research. Let us take I'm getting old. Jill? Joan, and Bowie.
Okay. I had a question about the animals.
Yeah.
Because you had said, or it says here in 24, that animals it's hard for them to regain the human state because they can't practice dharma or what is righteous
Yeah.
or doing any performance of merit. Just makes me think of all the animals, the dogs that people have
Yeah.
that are so trained.
Yeah.
They lead the blind. They bring comfort.
Yeah.
They work with children, like
Yeah. Yeah.
green
Yeah.
chimneys, and they seem to be performing good deeds, and they bring such comfort to so many people. And
Well,
those
I
are the ones
think,
that eat the dog.
I would, my opinion would be that domestic animals maybe get the chance to, those are the ones that get the chance to come out from the animal realm back into the human realm.
Yeah.
And also, I mean, there are cases that we read about every once in a while, like, say, if a house is burning and there's a family dog, a big dog, the dog will
Right.
jump into the flames and save the child, even at the risk of its own life.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
And then there are horses that do a lot of work for farmers, farm work. So one would think that they would be getting merit leading to a human rebirth.
Okay.
Well, that's another question. Yeah, well,
Bhante, you mentioned that to achieve liberation, the Buddha doesn't teach to avoid the heavenly to be reborn into the heavenly existence. Once one gains right view, the heavenly existence actually offer better or favorable conditions. I'd like to know what's the definition of the right view.
Well, to gain liberation from the heavenly realm, one would have to have, I would think, an understanding of things like the Four Noble Truths, the three characteristics of existence, conditionality. So one would need the kind of world-transcending right view. Not necessarily that one would have to be already be a stream enterer, but one would need to have that kind of understanding so that one can use it to develop insight. It would not be sufficient just to have the right view of karma and its fruits. That's my opinion. Okay, any further question? I'll just sort of wind up with one, going back to the matter of, I use the term social class, I have to say, it's a matter of terminology rather than caste, because I identify caste with jati, which is birth, in which there are very strict rules governing who can marry whom, who can sit and eat with whom. Okay, but on this matter, let me just finish my story. This is a story that's related in the Therigatha, the verses of the elder monks. There was a man who was working as a kind of, we would call it a garbage collector in the Buddha's time. This would have been regarded as a very low occupation. His name was Sunnita. And so his job was to go through the streets and collect all of the garbage that people would throw out. I guess they didn't use in those days garbage cans, and they didn't have garbage trucks driving down with people coming and taking the garbage cans and emptying them into the truck and then driving on. But people would just throw the garbage in the back of their houses, and then the garbage collectors would come maybe with these brooms and with sacks and brush the garbage into the sacks, collect it, and then take it outside the city. And so it was considered a very low occupation, and those who engaged in those occupations were considered basically untouchables. So there was this one man, Sunnita, who was engaged in that occupation, and then while he's doing his work, the Buddha comes walking down that road together with a group of monks, and Sunnita sees the Buddha coming, and he thinks, this is a high, holy man walking down the street, and I'm just a miserable, low, outcast garbage collector. And he sort of comes leaning against a wall, cringing against the wall as the Buddha gets closer and closer. Even he's afraid to enter the Buddha's shadow. But the Buddha comes walking up to him, and the Buddha is able to read his past dispositions, and then says to him, as he's cringing there, would you like to become a monk? And then Sunnita says, yes, I would like that. And then the Buddha says, then come and enter the order. And he becomes ordained as a monk, and he goes off and he practices meditation, and in no long time he achieves arahatship. And then one evening, he's sitting out in the open, I think it's a full moon night, and he's sitting out in the open in meditation, and the Buddha is a short distance away, and while Sunnita is sitting there, now an arahat, then Shakra, the king of the gods from the Tavatimsa heaven, comes and worships him. And then Mahabrahma, the deity of the Brahmins, comes and worships Sunnita. And then the Buddha recites a verse which describes the true Brahmin as not one, who is born into a particular social class or social caste, but one who is, fully illuminated with virtue and with wisdom. And so that's a kind of response to the class or caste system. Yeah. Yeah. Mm. Yeah. Yeah. Mm. 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 Yeah. 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 Mm. Mm. Yeah. Mm. Yeah. Mm.
Shudras regard themselves as members of their particular jati, and they don't recognize Brahman authority.
Mm.
Never say they were Shudras. Shudras is a formal term. Two-thirds of the people of the country,
Mm.
let alone the Adivasi's and the Dalits, who also feel this way.
Mm.
This is a claim of only 10% of the population
Mm.
about the character of India.
Mm.
It just happen to be the people who have the international connection.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, anyway, we'll end. I thought I could take this whole sutta today.